Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Gilmore and I'm going to be reading you the next few chapters of Front Desk. Chapter 4. Hank's words thrashed around inside me. Mr. Yao was strict, sure, maybe even a little dramatic, but coal for a heart? Hank couldn't possibly be right. This was the man who trusted us with his motel, was letting us live here for free, and was paying us $150 a day. The first thing the next day, I intended on setting Hank straight. But when morning came, my mother had other plans. "Let's go and see your new school today," she announced. I groaned. Another grade, another year as the new girl. When you've moved around as much as I have, checking out schools is like checking out shoe polish. So far, I'd gone to 4 different schools for 5 different grades. Dale Elementary School was about 5 blocks east from the motel and a lot bigger than my old school. It was late August, so classes didn't start for a couple of days. As Mom and I walked across the big empty parking lot, I wondered what kinds of kids went there. Nice kids, I hoped. We pushed open the door to the office, and the receptionist, a blonde lady with big curls that bounced as she moved her head, looked very surprised to see us. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Hi, I want to sign my daughter up for school. We just moved here," my mom said. The receptionist looked me up and down. I wriggled in my tattered pants and big old t-shirt from Goodwill. "I see," she said. She pushed a button on her desk and said, "Principal Evans, we have a new student here to see you." Principal Evans wore a blazer, even though it was 90 degrees outside. She looked like what my mother calls a powerful white lady. She insisted on taking us on a tour of the school, even though my mom said we didn't need a tour. I could tell she was anxious to get back to the motel. "It'll only take 10 minutes, Principal Evans said, leading us toward the gymnasium in her clickety-clackety black pumps. "So, Mia, tell me about yourself." I opened my mouth, but just before I could say anything, my mom blurted out, "She just moved here from China." Ugh. Why does she always have to tell people that? It wasn't even true. We'd been here for 2 years. Of course, as soon as my mother said those words, Principal Evans started talking to me like I was a turkey. "Really? Wow! How do you like this country?" she asked. "I really like it," I quickly answered. Principal Evans put her hand to her chest and exhaled in relief. "You know English! Oh, that's great. I have to admit, we don't get many Chinese kids here. There's only one other Chinese kid in 5th grade. She smiled at me and added, "I'm sure he'll be thrilled you're here." On the way home, my mom and I played our usual game, looking at big American houses and trying to figure out who lived inside. "A family with 2 girls, my mom said, pointing to the pink curtains upstairs. "And a cat," I said. There was a little door in the front door. I turned to my mom. "Hey, why do you have to tell the principal I just got here from China?" "So she'd cut you some slack?" I stopped, peering into the houses, and peered into my mom. "What do you mean?" "You heard what she said. There are only 2 Chinese kids in your grade." "So?" "So it probably means most of the other kids are white." "So?" "So they'll be way better at English than you," my mom said, matter-of-factly. I looked at the ground. "Not necessarily," I said. "I might not speak native English like Jason, but my English was a lot better than when I first came, I think. Plus, I liked English. I liked how you could say a train of thought or a blanket of snow, which you couldn't in Chinese. But it didn't matter how much I liked English. My mom had already decided. "Necessarily," she said. Chapter 5. We were surprised to find the maid cart right where we left it when we got back. It had not moved an inch. In the time that we were gone, my dad had only managed to clean 2 rooms. "I don't know how I'm going to get through all these rooms," he said, wiping his sweaty brow with the back of his hand. "I'll help you," I offered, rolling up my sleeves. In China, I sometimes help my grandmother scrub her kitchen floor. "No," my mom said, "I don't want you near that stuff." She pointed at the maid cart filled with various colorful bottles of cleaning solutions. "Then I'll man the front desk," I said. "I'll call you if I need anything." I ran out of the room, down the stairs before she could say no. "I've got this," I told myself on the way over to the front office. This was not going to be like the restaurant. This time, I was not going to fail. All I had to do was hand out keys and take the cash. How hard could it be? I got into position, climbing onto the front desk stool and crossing my hands on the desk. It did not take long before the customers started coming. Unfortunately, when they saw me, the first thing they did was ask to speak to the manager. So then I had to go get my mom. Up and down the stairs I ran. Every time she had to stop what she was doing to run down the stairs with me into the front office just to hand the customer the key and take the money. By the 5th time I thought, enough. I made a little sign and put it on the front desk. It read, Mia Tang, manager. The next customer came in and asked to see the manager, and I pointed to the sign, and I stared really hard at him. In science class at my last school, I learned that if you want a mammal to do something, you should stare at it. That's because mammals are social creatures and we're really into hierarchy. At the top, you have your alpha, the leader, then your betas and omegas. The difference between an omega and a beta is the alpha wins every staring contest. So I stared and stared until my eyes went blurry. And I was starting to see double, and even then I refused to blink. Finally, the customer broke down and said, Okay, fine. I just need a room for the night. Yes, it worked. That'll be $20 plus tax, I told him. I watched as he dug into his pocket, pulled out a 20 and a 5, and slid the bills across the desk. I gave him back his change and his key. The whole time I couldn't believe it was really happening. I was just a kid, but I had asked an adult to hand me money, and he actually did. I repeated my strategy with everyone else who walked through the door that day. Point, stare, point, stare. Eventually, I didn't even need to stare. People just went ahead and gave me the money. I was so happy. I hopped off the stool, opened the vending machine, and treated myself to a cream soda. I got one for Hank, too, and went to find him. Unfortunately, he wasn't home. Fred, one of the other weeklies, said he was working and wouldn't be home until late. When I got back to the front desk, the phone was ringing. The Calvista had an old-fashioned orange phone with a ton more buttons than a usual one. I didn't know what the extra buttons did, and for a second I fantasized that if I pushed the wrong button, the motel would start flying. Hello, I asked, picking up the receiver. Is this the front desk? A voice asked. I looked at the glowing light and saw a call was coming from room 6, which I had just rented to Mr. Stein. I cleared my voice. Mr. Stein, how can I help you? I asked, putting my best customer service voice on. I need a wake-up call tomorrow at 5 a.m., Mr. Stein said. Wake-up call? 5 a.m., I repeated. You got it. Don't forget, I have to leave for a very important meeting. I promised I wouldn't and hung up. For the next half hour, I studied the complicated phone system. There was a manual in the drawer, but it was one of those manuals that was impossible to read. It was like the manual they wrote for the walkie-talkies my mom used to make at the factory in China. Her walkie-talkies were great, but when they shipped them to America, nobody could figure out how they worked because the manuals were full of typos and mistakes. I chuckled and wondered if the Calvista phone system was also made in China, like me. It made me feel strangely close to it. All right, old friend, I said to the phone system, let's do this. I punched in the code for a wake-up call and entered the room number and time. To my amazement, the phone system made a beep. It worked. Pride swelled inside me as I drifted to sleep that night. It was a glorious first day. I'd rented out 12 rooms, 7 of which I'd done all by myself. Not only that, I'd gotten the phone system to work. I didn't need to worry about getting up early to wake up Mr. Stein. I could sleep easy knowing the awesome phone system would do it for me. Then the morning came. Chapter 6. Mrs. Clifton from room 5 came running up to the front office at the crack of dawn in her pajamas. She banged on the window. Open up! I need to speak to the manager! My parents and I jumped out of bed and buzzed her in. What's wrong? I got a wake-up call for no reason at 6 a.m., that's why. That darn phone system. It must have mixed up waking up Mr. Stein in room 6 at 5 and Mrs. Clifton in room 5 at 6 a.m. At the thought of Mr. Stein, I froze. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:10! He was going to miss his very important meeting. I raced out the back door in my pajamas and across the motel, nearly crashing into Mr. Stein as his door swung open. Mr. Stein stepped out of his room in his robe, squinting at the morning sun. What time is it? He asked. I swallowed hard. We had to give both Mr. Stein and Mrs. Clifton refunds that day. As I handed back the dollar bills I had worked so hard to collect, my dad put his hand on my back while I fought tears in my eyes. It brought me back to Mrs. Fletcher's class last year. Mrs. Fletcher was my 4th grade teacher at my last school, and every week she gave us a spelling quiz. Whoever got all the words right got to hold this special notebook for the day. The cover was rubber, and it looked and smelled like a giant bar of chocolate. You could keep it for the whole day, too, which meant any time you wanted, you could sniff the delicious chocolatey scent. The notebook was filled with little messages and jokes that all the past winners had written down that the rest of us couldn't read. It was like belonging to a club. Everyone wanted into this club, and so did I. But then I started getting my quizzes back and seeing all my mistakes, and the chocolate notebook became as reachable as the moon. I stopped looking at it, stopped even thinking about it, until one day, toward the end of the year, Mrs. Fletcher called my name. "The winner today is Mia," Mrs. Fletcher announced. The entire class spun around to look at me. They couldn't believe that some kid from China who was still learning English could win, and neither could I. There had to be some kind of mistake. But there was no mistaking it. Mrs. Fletcher was walking straight over to me with the notebook. She placed it on my trembling hands, and I held the notebook up to my nose and breathed in deep. As the rich, chocolatey smell swirled up my nose, I wanted to cry. I was so happy. Then I looked and saw Mrs. Fletcher's face. She was back at her desk, and she was looking over the spelling quizzes again. Something was wrong. "Wait a minute. Hang on, there's a mistake here," she frowned. "Mia, I'm going to need the notebook back." I shook my head and clutched the notebook tight. "No, you can't do this. You can't take it away. You just gave it to me." But she did. She got up, walked over, snatched it from my hands just as swiftly as she had placed it there. The velvety chocolate scent, along with the pride in my belly, disappeared. That's what's giving Mr. Stein and Mrs. Clifton back their money felt like that day. As I watched the bills slip away, the money I had worked so hard for my first day at the front desk, I wondered which was better, to have had something just for a second and then have it taken away, or to have never had it at all. Mr. Yao came by with his son Jason later that day. We weren't expecting him, but since it was his hotel, he could pop up any time he wanted. Jason and I sat at the front office while our parents talked in the living room. While he fiddled with the keys, I tried to make conversation. "So I checked a bunch of customers in yesterday," I said. He barely looked up. He wasn't much of a talker. "And it went super well," I said cheerfully. I left out the part about Mr. Stein and Mrs. Clifton. He didn't need to know about that. In the next room, our parents' voices grew louder. "That's not what we agreed to," I heard my mother say. "Says right here in the contract, terms may change from time to time," Mr. Yao replied. Jason and I looked at each other, and we ran into the living room. "But it's only been 2 days. You said we could have $5 a customer," my mom said. "Those were your words." I said $5 a customer, not including the first 10 and the weeklies. I jumped to my mother's defense. "You didn't," I said. "You said $5 a customer. You never said anything about first 10 or weeklies." "No," I heard him say it, Jason insisted. I narrowed my eyes at him. "You weren't even here." "You went to your room," I cut back. "Enough," Mr. Yao yelled. "That's the deal. Take it or leave it." I looked over at my mom. I could tell she was calculating how much money we'd be losing under the new arrangement. A lot, from the way she was chewing her cheek. I turned to Mr. Yao and tried again. "Please," I said to him. "We're working really hard. My parents didn't even finish cleaning until 8 last night, and the customers, they aren't so easy to deal with. We had to give 2 refunds this morning." Mr. Yao's eyes bulged. I felt myself shrink into from an alpha to an omega. "You had to give 2 refunds?" I bit my lip and nodded. "You're paying for those refunds," he fumed. My dad opened his mouth to protest and closed it. "Go ahead," Mr. Yao said. "Just say the word. There are 10,000 other immigrants who would take your job in 2 seconds. The blood drained from my father's face. "We want the job," he quickly reassured Mr. Yao. "Please, sir, we really want the job." The corners of Mr. Yao's mouth turned. On their way out, Jason leaned over. He had a smug look on his face. 2 refunds, huh? I thought you said it went super well yesterday. I felt my ears boil.